Module E1 Negative Externalities.
Markets do a remarkable job of providing for many wants and needs. That is, the invisible hand, guided by prices, certainly functions, and often functions very well. At the same time, there are many areas for concern. For example, we've previously seen that monopoly leads to a transfer of welfare from buyers to sellers and may make some goods downright unaffordable for some. In less professional language, there are markets in which we're getting ripped off. An entirely different problem arises when producing goods or consuming goods leads to environmental or other kinds of damage. In economics, we would say that the market process has resulted in costs which are external to supply or demand. These we call externalities. Negative externalities, or external costs, are costs imposed on third parties and not considered in the decisions of buyers or sellers. There are at least two problems when externalities are present but ignored by markets. First, there's no protection or consideration for the environmental damages that occur when markets don't take into account externalities. If we ignore these, then we are sure to produce lots of them and all to our detriment. Second, the invisible hand of prices are no longer accurate, and thus they do not provide the right incentives to buyers or sellers. For example, if the electricity I use causes lots of environmental harm in its production, which isn't paid for, then I'll use too much of this damaging electricity from an economic efficiency perspective. The economic perspective for dealing with these problems is to explicitly think about these external costs. So the way we go about doing this is we start by saying the costs that matter we'll call the marginal social cost. And these include all of the costs that we talked about previously. We'll now call those marginal private costs, and those are associated with what we termed market supply. But now we also have external costs as well, which should be considered in all market conditions. That's all lots to write out, so we almost always abbreviate that as marginal social cost equals marginal private cost plus marginal external cost, where we're simply using acronyms here for private, social, and external costs. Let's think about the outcome which we have when there is a negative externality present. We'll use our supply and demand framework to look at this again. And now for demand, I'll just put in an ordinary demand curve, but keep in mind that that is the benefit that is received from using a particular good. Let's think about that as being electricity that we were talking about. Now let's put in the costs. The costs that we should really think about as being important for both environmental protection and for economic efficiency as a whole is the marginal social cost. And using that marginal social cost intersecting our demand or our marginal benefit will give us what is the efficient level of production of electricity. Now suppose there are no environmental protections and the level of electricity produced takes into account only private costs. We can see this effect by starting again from our framework, but now we're going to add into it, in addition to the marginal social costs, we're going to add private costs as well. Let's start with demand, or our marginal benefit, and now let's add in the social costs that we had before. We identify that with the efficient level of output, which includes some environmental damage, but we include that and think about that in decision making. Now let's add in the marginal private costs, which are going to be less than those social costs, and they differ by the size of the externality. If society did not consider the social costs, then the result would be that a quantity Q sub P would result, and I label that meaning the result when the externality is not considered. We are lucky that in typical cases, there is at least some environmental protection, and so that we don't have the pure private solution, and we've moved towards the direction of better considering our use of the environment as one of many factors of production, one of many of the inputs in producing the well-being that we have today.